In Star Wars, we're told the galaxy is a battle between freedom and tyranny. Jedi fighting Sith, rebels fighting empires. But what if the real story has always been darker? What if the so-called freedom democracy was supposed to represent never actually worked at all? From the Old Republic to the New Republic, democracy is portrayed not as strength, but as weakness. The Old Republic drowned in corruption, paralysed by endless debate until Palpatine walked in and took everything without firing a shot. The New Republic repeated the same cycle, collapsing into chaos while the First Order rose from its ashes. These weren't isolated failures, they were patterns. And the truth is, Star Wars is brutally honest about this. The Senate chambers look impressive, but they achieve nothing. Padme warns them of tyranny, and they ignore her. Leia warns them of the First Order, and they laugh her off. When danger arrives, democracy folds instantly. It is never strong enough to resist. That's why Palpatine's line about liberty, dying with thunderous applause, hits harder today than ever. Because in the galaxy far, far away, freedom doesn't die in battle. It dies in meetings. It dies in committees. It dies because democracy refuses to defend itself. That's not dramatic. That's terrifying. It forces us to ask a bigger question. Was the rebellion really fighting for democracy? Or were they fighting just to reset the cycle so the next republic could fall the same way? Star Wars doesn't give us answers. It gives us a warning. That freedom is fragile and institutions are weaker than they look. In this video, we are going to explore why democracy failed in Star Wars, how those flaws paved the way for tyranny, and what the saga really tells us about the fragility of freedom itself. Star Wars loves to frame itself as a battle between freedom and tyranny. But when you actually look at how democracy functions in the galaxy, far, far away, it is almost laughable. The Old Republic, which we see in the prequels, is not some shining beacon of liberty, but a stagnant bureaucracy stuffed with corruption and endless debate. The Senate chamber itself is designed like a parody of efficiency. Thousands of floating pods where no one listens and no one acts until it is too late. This is less inspirational democracy and more a galactic DMV with better lighting. The Phantom Menace opens with trade disputes and blockades. Think about that for a second. Instead of addressing slavery on Tatooine or wars on the Rim, the Senate is bogged down in paperwork about shipping lanes. That alone shows you where its priorities lie. The Republic wasn't a government of justice. It was a government of procedure. And procedure is the one thing tyrants know how to exploit. Palpatine didn't have to overthrow the Republic with military might. He simply used its own flaws. Every time he proposed more power in the name of security, the Senate voted yes because they were too paralysed to do anything else. By the time the Clone Wars erupted, the Republic was so dependent on emergency powers that democracy was effectively dead long before the Empire was declared. The senators applauded as the system committed suicide. Even the Jedi were complicit in this failure. As guardians of the Republic, they bound themselves to a political system that had already rotted. Instead of acting as neutral peacekeepers, they became generals in a war orchestrated by a chancellor who was secretly their greatest enemy. That alliance shows just how weak the Republic's democracy was. It could not function without weaponizing religion and outsourcing its defense to a clone army. It barely understood. And it is not as if corruption was some rare flaw. Entire planets like Naboo were vulnerable to invasion because bureaucracy slowed every response. Entire systems like Mandalore begged for neutrality because they knew the Senate couldn't protect them. Whole regions like the Outer Rim lived essentially outside the Republic's laws because the Senate had neither the will nor the structure to govern effectively. It was a government in name more than in practice. When Padme says in Attack of the Clones that liberty dies with thunderous applause, she is not exaggerating. The Senate hands over power to Palpatine with near unanimity, not because they were brainwashed, not because they were enslaved, but because they were terrified and complacent. Fear is a natural part of politics, but in Star Wars, democracy never had the resilience to resist it. The moment crisis hit, the people's representatives folded instantly. And the problem isn't that the Republic was too democratic. The problem is that it was a democracy with no backbone. Senators cared more about local interests than galactic survival. lobbyists, and corporations like the Trade Federation or banking clan wielded more influence than entire planetary populations. It wasn't one bad apple ruining the system. The entire orchard was rotten, tu mind. After the fall of the Republic, the galaxy endured decades of imperial rule. And when the rebellion finally toppled Palpatine, you might expect the New Republic to learn from past mistakes. But instead they fell right back into the same traps. The New Republic was meant to be a restoration of freedom, yet it repeated every single weakness of its predecessor. If the Old Republic drowned in corruption, the New Republic drowned in apathy. One of the biggest problems was demilitarization. After defeating the Empire, the New Republic decided to downsize its fleet, believing the galaxy no longer needed a strong defense. On paper, this was noble. In practice, it was suicide. Because while the New Republic patted itself on the back, the remnants of the Empire quietly regrouped. Entire sectors in the unknown regions were left unchecked. That complacency birthed the First Order. The seeds of tyranny were allowed to grow while democracy looked the other way. Even structurally, the New Republic was a mess. Instead of learning from the centralized corruption of the old Senate, they went too far in the other direction. They rotated the capital planet every few years to avoid corruption, which sounds clever until you realize it meant constant instability. Imagine if Washington, D.C. moved every election cycle. That kind of chaos made long-term strategy impossible and created endless bureaucracy as each new capital tried to re-establish control. And again, corporations and special interests still thrived. The same republic that once bent to the Trade Federation now bent to whoever could pay for influence. Entire planets ignored New Republic laws without consequence. The Senate had no teeth. By the time Leia tried to warn them about the First Order, she was dismissed as a warmonger. The exact same arrogance that doomed the Old Republic resurfaced in its replacement. This is why the Resistance had to exist at all. Leia knew the New Republic couldn't protect the galaxy, so she built her own military force in secret. Think about that. One of the galaxy's most respected leaders had to go rogue because democracy couldn't defend itself. That isn't a triumph of freedom, that's an admission of failure. And the collapse came fast. In The Force Awakens, the New Republic's capital, Hosnian Prime, is destroyed in minutes. An entire galactic government wiped out before it even realized it was under attack. If the Empire exposed the Old Republic's weakness slowly, the First Order exposed the New Republic's weakness instantly. One superweapon and democracy crumbled. Again. The saddest part is how little anyone in the galaxy seemed to care. Local systems went back to fighting for themselves while the Resistance scrambled to fill the void. The very institution that was supposed to unify the galaxy shattered like glass. The Republic was so hollow that its destruction left almost no resistance to authoritarianism. Tyranny rushed back in because democracy was too fragile to hold the line. So what does all of this tell us about Star Wars as a whole? If democracy fails in both the Old Republic and the New Republic, what is the saga really saying? It's not just background politics for lightsaber duels. It's a statement about the fragility of freedom when people confuse process with strength. Star Wars is ultimately cynical about democracy. It shows us institutions that look impressive but crumble under pressure every single time. The Old Republic's flaw was corruption. The New Republic's flaw was apathy. Both mistakes point to the same truth. Democracy in Star Wars never developed the resilience to defend itself. When crisis came, it either paralyzed itself in debate or ignored the warning signs completely. That fragility is why Palpatine rose and why the First Order rose after him. In both cases, tyranny didn't overthrow democracy. Democracy collapsed and tyranny filled the vacuum. This also reframes the rebellion. We often think of them as defenders of democracy. But were they really? The rebellion fought for freedom, yes. But what they created after victory was just another weak Senate doomed to repeat the cycle. The heroes who risked everything for liberty didn't rebuild something better. They rebuilt the same fragile system and then watched it die all over again. That's not triumph. That's tragedy disguised as victory. The Jedi's role in all this is equally damning. They tied themselves to the Old Republic's survival and were destroyed with it. In the sequels, Luke retreats from the galaxy, not just because of personal failure, but because he sees the pattern. He realizes that democracy and Jedi orthodoxy are two sides of the same coin, institutions that look noble but rot from within. That's why his cynicism in The Last Jedi feels more earned when you view the bigger picture. Even small examples in the films hammer this point home. Padme is ignored when she warns of creeping authoritarianism. Leia is dismissed when she warns about the First Order. Politicians in both eras choose comfort over vigilance until it's too late. Star Wars keeps telling us that liberty dies not because of some unstoppable villain, but because democracy refuses to take responsibility for its own survival. And the irony is that the only truly effective governments we see in Star Wars are authoritarian. The Empire and the First Order are brutal, but efficient. They make decisions quickly and enforce them ruthlessly. It's terrifying, but it works. Star Wars forces us to sit with that uncomfortable truth. In this galaxy, tyranny outperforms democracy every single time. That doesn't mean Star Wars endorses dictatorship. What it does is warn us about complacency. The Republic's failed not because democracy can't work, but because people assumed it would work automatically. They forgot that freedom requires vigilance, constant maintenance, and sometimes sacrifice. Without those things, democracy is just a building waiting to collapse.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.